Hey everyone, Andrew here. In this video, I wanted to encourage you with the stories of two historic Canadian revivals. When we look at Canada today, it's easy to become pessimistic with the state that we're in. Like John Wesley's description of the natural man, it seems that our country is wandering farther and farther from the living God. But the truth is, Canada did not begin as a New Jerusalem, just the opposite. As we'll see, one writer even compared the early Canadian colonies to the cities of Sodom's plain. And yet it was into that world that revival sparked and inflamed, and it can happen again. In this video, we'll look at the Newfoundland revival of 1768 or 69, and then the Elizabethtown revival that began in 1817. Anyone who doubts the power of the gospel to transform whole societies need only read these accounts to quench those doubts. Our story begins in Newfoundland colony 1765. A single missionary with not even a Christian friend with him, and with no sending church or agency, arrives to find what is basically an unreached people group. His name was LAURENCE Coughlan. Here's how one account describes the people he met. Not a school was known in the island, nor a single temple raised there to worship God Almighty. Men who had come from England had never even seen a minister since they left their native shores, and those who had been born on the island had never seen one their entire lives. The Sabbath was unknown, there was none to celebrate marriage, and the marriage vow was little regarded. Oppression, violence, swearing, debauchery, profanity, and every crime that can degrade human nature, sink civilized man to a savage, or even reduce him below a brute, was practiced without check. In a word, the people were demoralized to an extent that could scarcely have been exceeded by the thunder-smitten inhabitants of Sodom's plain. Surely there was no place that stood more in need of a missionary than did Newfoundland. One Newfoundlander who had heard Coughlan preach described the colony this way. "You cannot think what a state Newfoundland was in when that man of God came among us. Imagine any sin you will, and you cannot think of anything too bad. He would sometimes describe the sins of the land in language that polite people would seem to be shocked at, and yet they knew he was speaking only the truth." Another account says they were perfect savages, strangers to all good order, government, and religion, averse to and unfit for labor. It was a common thing for men and women to live together without marriage and to change partners at pleasure. The moral tone of the colony was adversely affected by the large consumption of rum and other liquors. So far as can be learned, no minister had ever visited these settlements up to the time of Coughlan's arrival. Coughlan himself said, as to the gospel, they had not the least notion of it, yet drinking, dancing, gaming, those they were acquainted with. So that's the country. Have I painted a bleak enough picture for you? What about the man for the job? Surely he was some super apostle, right? Not even close. LAURENCE Coughlan was once an itinerant preacher, originally appointed by John Wesley himself, but accounts show that they did not often get along. The few times that Wesley mentions him are not stellar. He once described him as a man with no learning at all, and another time said that he had even brought another blot upon himself by marrying and financially ruining an unnamed woman. They did, however, maintain something of a friendship and continued correspondence throughout Coughlan's life. In any event, by 1765 his name no longer appears in the list of conference appointments, and instead we find him preaching a world away to the hardy and neglected fishermen around the rugged coasts of Newfoundland without any explanation of when or why he arrived. Alexander Sutherland writes in his History of Canadian Missions that Coughlan was not commissioned by any church nor appointed by any human authority, and we can only surmise that he had heard, as Paul did, a divine mandate. And when he arrived, was he greeted with instant revival? Not a chance. For 3 long years he preached without, in his words, seeing even the least appearance of awakening. None. He writes about how miserable he felt during that time. Here are his words. "This was very disappointing to me, insomuch that I often concluded that God had never called me to that place. This kept me exceedingly low. At last I was determined that I would not stay in such a poor, desolate land and spend my strength for naught." And so, Sutherland says, disheartened and discouraged, he prepared to leave the country, when quite suddenly the settlements around Conception Bay were swept by a mighty revival. The old indifference disappeared. Coughlan writes that for those 3 years he had visited house to house expanding portions of God's word, but he perceived not the least fruit of his labor. But continuing that same practice, now he writes, "At length God was pleased to bless my endeavors in a very wonderful manner, for now many were pricked to the heart and cried out, 'What must I do to be saved?' Some prayed aloud, others praised or shouted for joy, telling what God had done for their souls. Under almost every sermon and exhortation some were cut to the heart. The word was now like fire, or like a hammer that breaketh the rock to pieces. Now the word was indeed quick and powerful. Sutherland recounts, as the work spread around Conception Bay and a marked change took place in the habits of the people, the report went abroad that the town had gone mad, but this only had the effect of bringing people from a distance of many miles to see and hear for themselves. Not a few who came to scoff remained to pray. At Blackhead, about 18 miles away, the people were so desirous of having a place to worship that in less than 14 days they erected and covered in a building large enough to accommodate 400 people. And so Coughlan began to arrange the people into bands. Writing to Wesley, he says, "The plan which you first taught me I have followed, both as to doctrine and discipline. Our married men meet apart once a week, and our married women do the same." With failing health in 1773, Coughlan returned to England. The last that we hear of him is a letter where Wesley mentions that in 1776, "The last time I saw Mr. Coughlan, he was ill in body, but in a blessed state of mind. He was utterly broken in pieces, full of tears and contrition for his past unfaithfulness. Not long after I went out of town, God removed him to a better place." It is not clear how many people were saved during his ministry, but there's records of 3 Methodist churches being built during the time that he was in Newfoundland. 100 years later, it was recorded in the census that more than 50% of the population of Newfoundland recorded themselves as Methodists. Such magnificent results, wrote the Centennial of Canadian Methodism, may well lead us to exclaim, "What hath God wrought? To God be all the praise." The next revival we'll discuss began at the First Canadian Methodist Conference in Elizabethtown, Upper Canada, today part of Ontario. Alexander Sutherland, in his History of Canadian Missions, looking back from 1904, writes that this event marked the beginning of the most extensive revival of religion that had ever occurred in the country, and it may be questioned if it has ever been exceeded even to this day. The total ingathering, listen to this, was about 1,400 souls. This reads like something straight out of Acts. Imagine if you had 1,400 new believers in your city today. Another historian, Joseph Sanderson, looking back from 1908, said that it set the beginning of a mighty Pentecostal season, a prophetic foreshadowing of many to follow with similar manifestations of divine power. But unlike the first revival we looked at, this one didn't begin suddenly. It was first 10 people, then 100, then the flame continued to grow. There was no pomp. I had to look through multiple sources even to find the name of the first preacher, but it seems to have begun on the Sunday morning under the preaching of Bishop George, an American who came north for the conference. One attendee describes, "Strong emotions swayed the congregation, penitents were conducted to the front, and a prayer meeting was begun, a season of power and glory. Many were brought under awakening, and 10 persons found peace in believing." Again, it began with just 10, but they felt the special presence of God, and so the services were continued all day, during which time 5 more sermons and a number of exhortations were delivered. As word got out, we are told that the meeting house was filled from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 in the evening, with the power of God displayed at most of the meetings. Throughout the whole sitting of 5 days, the word was delivered with much freedom and power. Conversions now became frequent. It's believed that during the sessions of the conference, more than 100 persons were awakened, of whom the greater part found peace in believing. And what did these sessions look like? Here are some of the reports. One eyewitness recorded that the deist and the drunkard, as well as the moralist and children of 10 years old, found one common place at the altar of penitence, and calling on the Lord for mercy, we were made to rejoice with unspeakable joy. Whole families were made the subjects of saving grace, and not a few who had declined in religion were reclaimed and restored to their first love. The neighboring townships now took the flame. From attending the preaching at the conference, the people returned to their homes with great seriousness and earnest prayer for the divine blessing. The revival then extended to all parts of the circuit, and then through the fields westward. In 14 months, more than 300 persons in the Bay region professed conversion, many of whom were heads of families. One of the presiding elders wrote, "Among the hundreds of whose eyes the tears of gratitude and joy were falling, were 8 persons above the age of 60 who had lately obtained mercy. One of them was a man of 75, another of 72. Blessed God that all of his children, 7 in number, were converted. Of Roman Catholics there was a few conversions. At this meeting, an aged woman came to the altar weeping. In the French she said, 'I was yesterday, Saturday, at the meeting here, and while the minister was preaching, the Lord broke my heart. His love came into my soul.' She had been previously awakened." Another records, "Almost 2 months after the revival first began, at one of these meetings a youth was present who had lately found peace with God, and who had come from a distant town to visit his relatives, and feeling a great desire for the salvation of his acquaintances, he arose and addressed the meeting with the subject of his late conversion, and he invited them all to taste the joys of the great salvation. The divine power seemed to rest on all present, and the youths especially were broken into contrition, and they requested the prayers of the assembly. Their case was immediately carried to God in prayer. The meeting continued several hours, and 6 young persons found peace with God before the close." The news of that meeting brought numbers together, and soon the meeting grew so large that no house in the settlement could hold the people, so that they went into the field and spent the time in preaching and praying for the distressed. At every meeting numbers were converted. Like a devouring fire, the revival spread through the neighborhood. Thence it traveled east, then north, then through the German settlements, around the head of the bay and on so to the river, sweeping in its irresistible course almost all the families in the way. Then westward to the Niagara circuit, the gracious influence spread, resulting in conversion of 400 or 500 in just a few months. Other circuits shared largely in the general outpouring. Preachers and societies now caught the flame. From settlement to settlement, revival news was carried. Conversions were multiplied 10 or a dozen at a single prayer meeting, and whole families rejoiced together. Even into November, we're told that the revival continued to spread, and great numbers were converted to God. At the prayer meetings, many hundreds would assemble. Boatloads would even cross the bay to attend the meetings, and many persons would return the happy converts of Jesus' love. Some who had always been careless about eternal things were awakened by seeing the multitudes flocking to the place of worship. The revival extended to the Hallowell circuit, where we're told after the American Revolutionary War, the disbanded British Army was settled, and among the disbanded soldiers were scores of conversions. The revival began in a prayer meeting. The religious influence so prevailed that in a few weeks and in this thin population, 60 persons were converted. Entire families, almost entire neighborhoods were subjects of God's work. In the east part of the township, there was scarcely a family from which the voice of prayer and praise had not been heard. Now remember, this is only a few short years after the War of 1812, when these Canadian colonies and the Americans were at war, and yet here is a revival that began under the preaching of an American, and the soldiers are responding. Don't ever think that God can't reach across national boundaries and biases and break down the wall of hostility. Sutherland says there would be nothing remarkable at all of this in some crowded center of population where people could be reached in large masses, but in a population as sparse as that of Canada at the time, the results were really wonderful. In this respect, the first conference in Canada stands without parallel, as far as I know, among Methodist conferences throughout the world. George Plater writes, "A great impression was made on the public mind by the strange, sometimes wonderful, change of the character and life in so many persons and in so short a time. The young were now serious, fond of the Bible, and seeking knowledge to make them useful. Those indifferent to religion, lovers of pleasure and not lovers of God, were now zealous for the truth and lovers of the Sabbath. The quarrelsome had learned, in meekness and love, to bear with evil ones and to forgive. Many drunkards had substituted the house of God for the tavern, the psalm and the hymn for the songs of the bar, and the cleanliness and sobriety for rags and strong drink. Rude companies and neighborhoods loved the devout assembly of the saints, spent their Sabbaths in the house of God, and became orderly, civil, and hospitable." How long did these results last? 50 years later, at the time of the Canadian Confederation, Methodism would be the largest Protestant group in Canada, at over 500,000 members and over 15% of the Canadian population. I hope you found this video encouraging. Lord, we pray you do it again. Thanks for watching.